Hello everyone and welcome to this video lecture on V-Ray for Rhino. This is one of a few different videos we're going to be looking at for rendering styles. This one in particular is looking at high-end rendering and the possibilities you can achieve using V-Ray instead of the normal Rhino renderer. So V-Ray by default, and I guess you might have picked this one up earlier, is a lot more intensive. Not only in terms of the learning curve, it's quite a steep learning curve, but also in terms of intensive on your computer, intensive on the hardware that you're running. So typically we're going to use V-Ray for maybe your part model. Maybe there's some qualities of your model that you're 3D printed, or you've CNC milled, or you've laser cut. It's not quite coming out in the model. And you really want to articulate those haptic qualities through a render. Or maybe you're in the final assessment and you've got the proto house looking a certain way, but you want to zoom down into some specific details, or you want to really get some high quality shots and renders to put in. Now, while not everybody's going to be able to use V-Ray to render out the entire proto house, in fact very few people are going to be able to do that because it's so intensive, I do still recommend V-Ray for looking at chunks or looking at details or looking at smaller parts of the model. This is where we can really bring out some of those tactile haptic qualities that we want to see. So this is the kind of thing that we can bring out of V-Ray. I've just been having a play here with glass and looking at caustics and different kinds of qualities. This sort of stuff isn't really possible in the normal Rhino renderer, and really going to be difficult to do through collage as well in Photoshop too. So if this is the kind of quality, or if you're looking at metallic surfaces or anything with lots of reflections and caustics, Fresnels as well, you really do want to be looking at V-Ray for that kind of thing. Again, it's not the whole proto house, it's just a part of it. Okay, so let's dive in. Here we are in Rhino. I've already got V-Ray installed. So to do that, it's a pretty simple, straightforward thing. In Google, V-Ray for Rhino, go down to the V-Ray for Rhino under the food for Rhino. That's where you download all of the best plugins for Rhino inside here. Download it and install it. Once it's downloaded, Rhino will need to be closed down in order for the plugin to be installed, and then you can reopen it back up again, and you should have all of these V-Ray toolbars. They might be sitting in the middle of the page the first time you open it up. Just grab the main one, throw it up the top there, and then you are ready to go. So we've got a little object here, and we'll have a look at the different ways to use this. So this is the basic setup, what they call the command center. Over to the left is where you'll be able to see all of your materials, and these materials are downloaded through the V-Ray assets folder. So they'll already be in there for you. That's just checking for updates at the moment. There we go, that's loaded. Over on the right hand side, if we click this arrow, that tells us what we are looking at the moment. So I've got glass crystal I've already installed. You probably have nothing yet, but just as an example, once a material is clicked on, we can see we've got some different settings there. So let's go back to basics and we'll go one by one in terms of figuring out what this thing is going to look like. At a starting point, let's go over to our settings dialog, and we're going to open up a little interactive renderer so we can see in real time the changes that we make inside the settings box. So go over to your settings cog, and what I want you to do is go over to interactive, turn that on, and then we're just going to turn this all the way down to low before we do anything, and that's going to make sure we're not being too heavy. Again, we're only really looking at a part or a chunk or a detail, probably not the whole house unless you have an amazing computer. Click on render with V-Ray interactive. This is going to open up a little box. Here we go, give it a second, it will come up, there it is. That's going to do a partial render of what we see in the scene. So remember, it's depending on what your viewport is selected, that's going to be the one that's showing. So if I move around in here in this viewport in the background perspective, we can see that that's live updating what we see there in terms of a basic model. All right, so now that we've got that running, I'm just going to leave this over here. I'll make it a little bit smaller, so just so that we can see what's going on, I'm going to put that over there. And that way you'll see as we make certain changes to our command center, what that does to the final product. This isn't the final render quality. We've already put that down to low before, so it's going to look better than this. This is just the interactive version so that we can see as we make adjustments. All right, So our material settings, that's pretty straightforward. You will have seen material settings before in any other basic renderer, including in Rhino itself. So we've got glass turned on at the moment. Some beautiful glass work in here. My personal favorite is the glass crystal, which is this one. Let's have a look at something different though. We'll go over to plastics. We'll choose a fun one. Let's get one with some color. Okay, so we've got green in here. I'm going to drag and drop this into our materials box. Then when I've got my surface, my chunk, whatever it is selected that I want to apply that material to, I go right click and apply to selection, and then that is going to show over here. Okay, so you can select all sorts of different materials. You can select multiple materials. You can select one and leave the others ready to put different materials on. Whatever you like to do is fine. You just select it first and then right click on the material, apply to selection when you're ready. All right, so over on this right hand tab, again, this is just in this little arrow here. We've got a few different options we can play around with, and this is going to change depending on what type of material. So this is a matte plastic, so there's not a lot in terms of reflections and things that we can play with there. So why don't we change that over to a stochastic black, right click, apply to selection. There we go. So we can see we've got glossiness this time, so I can turn that up and play with the glossiness. I can turn on the reflection, IOR, and the Fresnel. And then I can really start to play around with this as well. So I can turn up the metalness. That's going to give us some shine and some sheen to our options there. I can turn up the high-end glossiness over on this one here, and that's really starting to look quite glossy, particularly on the inside. So if I move this around, if I zoom down, we can see we're getting some nice glossiness inside there at the moment. Okay, so that is a plastic glossy material. Let's have a look at a metal, which has been very popular. I want something super shiny, so I'm just going to search inside the metals, and I'm going to go chrome polished. I right click, apply to selection, and I'll see that is looking very nice already. So I've got a beautiful shiny polished surface on the inside. I can see I can play with the reflection settings in there, refraction. I've got a coat on the outside, which is doing certain things as well. And that is all going to change in real time, and we can see what's going on there. All right, so that's our materials. That's the first one we're playing with. Next one we want to do is play with the environment and the lighting. So change over from materials to light. By default, we've just got the Rhino document sun, which does not have too much in terms of maneuverability, adaptability. So we're going to go over to our dome lighting here, and we click in the field, and we're going to open up our program files, chaos group, V-Ray, and then we go into maps, and then I'm going to get this box 6 HDR that you'll see immediately is going to update what is going on with those settings there in the background. Okay, I'm going to come back to this in a second, what that all means in terms of the environment. But first, I want to change a few more of the other settings. So we don't need to worry about these ones along here. Again, I'm going to come back to the environment in a second. So let's jump all the way forward to settings. At the moment, we're in interactive view, so we can see what's going on there. So we'll go down to camera. In camera, we can play with the lighting level. So the exposure value, the lower the number, the more light it lets in. So for example, if I bring that down to 9, we can see that's going to increase the exposure that we have there. Depth of field is going to allow us to pick a specific point of focus. So for example, if I turn this on and I click this pick point button, I can pick a specific point inside. Here we go. Let's zoom into this one here. Get that knot, and we can see that it's now focused to that specific knot in space. That part there. Again, we're on the low settings for interactivity, so this is all dependent on our settings in terms of how much we'll see. We can change the amount it defocuses the surrounding versus what's in the foreground. Obviously, that's way too much defocus, so we're losing everything. We can bring that all the way down there, and that's going to give us a lot more of a variance. Turn that off. Depth of field, we don't need that for right now. Effects, again, not super important. Let's just jump into the render output. I want to have a square, and I'm going to bump this up. It's 450 pixels too small, so I'm going to jump that to 1500, and then we'll see that that has zoomed out. In order for this to take effect properly, I just need to close this, stop the interactive render, give that a second to stop. Then we're going to turn it back on again, and now when I zoom out, I see that I've got a much bigger image here. It's the 150 by 150. You notice because we've also increased the pixel range from 400 to 1500, now we've got a much clearer looking image as well. Okay, so that is our camera settings. Again, there's a lot more that we can play with inside there. What we want to do is I want to change what's going on in our background. So if I move this around a bit, we can see that I've got this gray background going on at the moment. Two things that we need to think about. So before we talked about this environment texture that we've got going on. So this environment texture is this gray background that's here. Now this might be fine for a render that you're putting out, but for me, I want this thing to be sitting on pure black or a pure white. So what I've done is I've gone into Photoshop and I've made a 1500 by 1500 in black. So that's ready to go for me. Here it is. I've just called it black square. Super easy. And now that means I'm going to have a nice black background. So that is the texture of our background, but we also have a texture of the actual lighting itself. This is what I was talking about before when I said I'm going to come back to it. So now it's going to make a little bit more sense. If we go over to our dome light, this is the HDR texture that we put in before. That was the room. So I've got another one here, which is road. If I change that, we see that I've now got this sky, which is up here, and a bit of that orangey strip of desert road in the background is getting caught up in there. And I've got a few other examples as well. So if I jump out to my downloads, I've got a few more I've got here. So I've got an empty warehouse, which is going to get some really nice lighting on there. I've got a park, and that's going to get more blue sky on there as well. And I've got a quarry. There we go. So depending on what we have in our HDR environment, that is going to change what we see in the reflections. So that's really important to know and understand. Personally, I actually prefer the default one. So back to program files, chaos group, V-Ray for Rhinoceros into our maps. This one here, the box, I think gives me the nicest reflections going through there. All right, so that's all looking very nice, but something we will notice is if we try and look up at the model, we try and get a low down view, we're going to have this background environment shown there. So if we jump back to here, we can see if I change to this one, it's going to have the blue sky. Sure, that's going to be showing in our reflections, but if we want to look up at it, it's going to have that blue sky in the background. We're going to be able to see that image sitting in the background. So what we need to do is we need to jump back to dome light, go into options, and then just click on invisible. And what that will do is it will keep the reflection in there, so we still get to see the image, but it will hide what's going on in the background. So if I change that one to our box, now we can see we've got that beautiful metallic surface inside there, but it doesn't matter which angle we look at it from, we're not going to see any of that background there. And that's looking really kind of lovely. All right, so we've hidden our background environment by making things invisible. Let's say though that you don't want to use either of the two defaults from V-Ray. Where can we get some more of these background environments for your renders? So if we jump over to here, Polyhaven. So Polyhaven's a free website. There are heaps and heaps and heaps of HDRIs, and this is what those background environments are called. The reason why I really like this is because it shows through these little spheres what it's going to look like in glass, what it's going to look like with a matte finish, what the reflections are going to look like, and what it's going to look like with a gloss finish. You can also see by comparison how much light is going to be given to your object through the background, because remember that dome that we created in Rhino is where most of our light is coming from. So the amount of light that you can see in this image on these objects, that's going to come into your render, but also the qualities of the reflections and the qualities of the refractions when we're talking about glass. So all you need to do is scan through here, think about what you want to be able to see in your reflections. If you want busyness, like it might be inside a house if you want it to be sitting in a landscape, or my personal favorites is the studios, as you know. Once we choose one, all we have to do is click download. That will go to your downloads folder. Go back into Rhino, open it up, get your downloads, and then you'll have a download folder, and then you can simply double click and that will bring it in for you with the previous settings in there. Okay, so that's our environment done. I want to change this back to glass now. So let's go back to our material settings. We've got that glass crystal, right click, apply to selection. Give that a second to update. Okay, that's looking pretty interesting. Just need to change the location of the image. So this is what the interactive is really helpful for, because you can get the perfect angle before you go into the high quality render mode. I'm just going to fudge this down a little bit more. That might have been too much. No, I'm happy with that. That looks good. All right, so now that that's done, I can see the lighting wasn't quite as strong, and that's because we're now at glass instead of chrome, so we don't have as much reflection going around to amplify that. Now, two things we can do. We can turn up the dome light, so this is at 1, we can make that 2 or 200%. That's going to increase the amount of lighting that we have on top of here. That looks pretty nice. The other thing we can do is, of course, go back to the camera and increase the exposure. Remember, smaller number is going to add more exposure to the scene, lets more light into the lens. All right, that is looking pretty good. I'd say maybe a bit overexposed now, actually. I'm going to put that back down to 9, but at least you still know what your options are there. All right, so we've done our materials, we've set up our lighting, we've got the environment working with the black background, and then our sky dome is turned on. We've made it invisible so we can see something in the reflections but nothing in the background. We have got our camera set up to 1500 by 1500 square. We're turning off depth of field, but you could put that back on if you want to. Now we are ready to make our render. So first thing we need to do is close this. Then we can stop our interactive render, turn our interactive render off. Then quality, the first one you want to do is probably at medium, and you can figure out from there what works for you. You can go all the way up to high plus when you're ready for your final renders, but for now, while we're still doing a test, I'm going to put that at medium. Don't worry too much about all of these settings over here. You can play with them as you get more advanced, and of course there are videos online to learn about that. For now, let's go ahead and play with our defaults, and I'm just going to click on render. So give that a second. That is going to render out. If I make this bigger, we'll see that down here, rendering image, this is going to give us a timeline. So the timeline hasn't even started yet. We can see it's got quite a long way to go. I'm running complex Rhino, and I'm also streaming this at the same time. So this will take me quite a while. I'm going to pause here and I'll resume when it's finished. All right, so we're back now and we have our render. So the render is actually still going for me. It's not finished yet, but I wanted to show you that you can actually stop it before it's done and still save the render. So if it's getting to a certain point where you're an hour in, you're happy with the quality of what it looks like, you don't really need to keep it denoising or keep it rendering any more than what it already is. That's fine. So what we do when we're ready for that, we come up to stop, and that's going to abort rendering. Then go over to here where it says save. We go save, and then I'm going to save this to my downloads. Let's just call this glass test. There we go. That is saved, and then what we're going to show you is in Photoshop how to finish off the image. So you can see here I've been having a nice little play today with all the different options. New file, so 1500 by 1500, create. And then we're going to go and get our surface, glass test, and drag and drop it inside Photoshop. So what we will see here is this is actually a white background, or it appears to be a white background. Now, not so much. So I'm going to go over to Photoshop layers, and then G for background. I've got a musty kind of reddy color just to illustrate the point here. So by default, when you create a PNG in V-Ray, what it's going to do is just carve out the shape perfectly. and not put any background behind it at all, which means, which is perfect for us, we can put it on top of anything we like. So we can sit this on top of another render, for example. If you wanted to have one sitting in the foreground that you do in V-Ray, which is super high quality, but you've got a different render, which is more of a collage, or from the Rhino default renderer, because it was much quicker for the rest of the proto house, you can very simply just put this one over the top of the other because it's a PNG with no background. Or you might want to put this onto a color, or you might have an image which sits in the background, something else that is on your A1 panel, for example, if you're in the final assessment. You actually really do want to have no background behind it. If you're perfectly happy just having black or white as your background, of course you can do that too in Photoshop. Very easy to do. G for paint bucket, change to black, and then we've got that there. We can position it where we want as we're happy with. Perfect. Flatten the image, save as, and we can make that one of our beautiful images that we've got there. Test, glass, beautiful, and that's ready to go, and that'll give us our black image sitting on the background there. Perfect, ready to go. So that is, in a nutshell, V-Ray rendering. We've got our interactive viewpoint, we've got our materials, we've got our various settings that we need to play with. We've got the Polyhaven HDR eyes that we can put in the background for our environment. But generally speaking, V-Ray gives us a lot of control. So there are so many more things that I haven't shown in the video here that you can experiment with and play with to really amp it up a notch. But this gives you a good basic fundamental understanding of how to use V-Ray to get those high quality renders of a close-up or of your chunk or of a specific part of your model. And you can really bring those haptic qualities together. That's all for now. Happy rendering.